I spent 2 weeks in a coma, hanging between life and death. When I finally opened my eyes, I wasn't greeted by my son's face, but by a crumpled note on the nightstand. "Dad, you've been nothing but a burden. Figure it out yourself. Don't call me." I cried for hours, feeling like my world had ended, until a stranger in an expensive suit walked into my room and said, "Mr. Miller, or should I say Alexander Brennan, your son just made a huge mistake. He just abandoned a man worth $800. Milieu." Before the story begins, type in the comments which city you're listening from. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bringing you even more powerful stories. I've spent 2 weeks in a coma, balanced between life and death. When I finally opened my eyes, the person I needed most was gone. The first thing I noticed was the smell, sharp antiseptic mixed with bleach. It burned my nose and turned my stomach. Even breathing felt unfamiliar, like my lungs had forgotten their job. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, stabbing my vision with harsh white glare. My head throbbed as if it was split down the middle. I tried to move and pain answered instantly, rolling through every muscle. A machine beeped beside me in cold, steady rhythm. My throat burned from the tube they must have used. My fingers twitched. At least I could still move them. I turned my head and spotted an empty plastic chair in the corner, the kind meant for visitors who stayed too long. It was perfectly placed and completely vacant. The sight made my chest tighten. Someone should have been sitting there. Where was David? For 2 weeks, I had been lying here, and he was gone. That couldn't be right. My son would never abandon me. I told myself he was getting coffee, talking to doctors, handling insurance. He was responsible. He always had been. Except deep down I knew I had always been the one holding everything together. Memories poured in without permission. 2 jobs, 4 a.m. newspaper routes, warehouse shifts that ended near midnight. Power bills paid just in time. Food always on the table. I gave up my house to send him to Harvard. I had stood in the crowd at graduation, heart bursting as he swore he would make me proud. He had succeeded beyond anything I imagined. A high-rise office, expensive suits, a job title I barely understood. He earned in a year what I earned in a decade. I told myself every sacrifice had been worth it. He was living the life I built for him, so why wasn't he here when I needed him most? I tried to sit up and failed. My body felt like it was made of lead and fire. Vague memories surfaced: a wet staircase, a sudden slip, the world tilting hard and fast, darkness after that. Had David found me? Had he called for help? I clung to those questions because the alternatives were too painful to consider. I turned my head again and saw a crumpled piece of paper on the bedside table left beside the water pitcher like an afterthought. No envelope, no care, just abandoned. My pulse shot up as I reached for it with shaking fingers. The 4 tugged at my hand, but I barely felt it anymore. The handwriting hit me before the words did. I knew every curve, every heavy stroke. I had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, and loan papers. Relief rushed through me so fast, it nearly stole my breath. David had been here. He had left me a message, maybe an explanation, maybe a promise to return. My hands trembled as I unfolded the wrinkled page. The paper was torn from a notebook, ink pressed so hard it bled through. Each second stretched tight inside my chest. This was the moment everything would make sense. Where he had gone, why he wasn't here. I braced myself, heart pounding, and finally read the words that would change everything. I knew, even before reading it, that the man who woke up would never again be the same person. The note was short, just a few lines, but each word was a knife stabbing into my chest. The handwriting was David's, rushed, heavy, angry strokes that bled through the paper. "Dad, I can't keep paying your medical bills. You've been nothing but a burden since Mom died. Figure it out yourself. Don't call me David." I'll read it again, hoping the words would change. They didn't. Nothing but a burden. The room spun. My chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. I'd worked 2 jobs for 15 years so David could have everything I never did. Sold my parents' house, the only thing I'd ever owned, to pay for his Harvard MBA. And this is what it meant to him. Nothing. Since Mom died 5 years ago. Cancer took her in 6 months. David had cried at her funeral. Real tears. I'd held him and thought, at least we still have each other. I'd been wrong. Figure it out yourself. The tears came before I could stop them. Hot and unstoppable. A sob ripped from my throat, raw and ugly. The note slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor. How could he do this? How could my own son abandon me like I was trash? He couldn't be bothered with. I'd thought when I woke up, David would be here, maybe asleep in that corner chair, maybe talking to doctors about my recovery, maybe holding my hand. What a stupid dream. The heart monitor beeped faster, matching the panic in my chest. I pressed my palms against my eyes, but the tears kept coming. My whole body shook. I was alone, completely alone. No wife, no son, no family. Just me in this sterile room with machines, tracking whether I lived or died, and nobody who cared either way. The door opened. Mr. Miller, a nurse, stood there with kind-faced scrubs with cartoon hearts. Her name tag read, Linda. She held a tissue box. Are you in pain? Should I get the doctor? I shook my head. What could a doctor do for this? She glanced at the note on the floor. I saw the moment she understood. Pity filled her eyes. Is there someone I can call family? I almost laughed. No, there's no one. She handed me tissues and squeezed my hand. You're stronger than you think, Mr. Miller. I didn't believe her. She left. Had to. Other patients needed her. The door closed. The silence crushed me again. 68 years old, broken, abandoned, lying here with nothing and no one. This was how my life turned out. I stared at the ceiling, feeling everything drain away. Hope, purpose, the will to keep fighting. What was the point anymore? I thought I had lost everything. Then the door opened and a stranger in an expensive suit walked in, looking at me like he'd been searching for me his entire life. The stranger wasn't a doctor, not hospital staff either, but the way he looked at me like I mattered left me confused. Sometime in the afternoon, warm light filtered through the window. I must have dozed off after the nurse left. Exhaustion had dragged me. When I awoke, the harsh glare had softened into something gentler, golden, almost warm, and the man was still there. He'd moved closer now, the visitor's chair pulled right beside my bed. He sat with perfect posture back, straight, hands folded, as if he'd been waiting patiently for me to wake with all the time in the world. The first thing I noticed wasn't his face, but the scent. It replaced the hospital's choking antiseptic cedar. Citrus, a hint of leather, expensive, sophisticated, the kind of cologne you couldn't buy at a drugstore. Then I looked at him fully. He was older, around 60, but carried his age with the grace of someone who'd lived well. His charcoal suit was immaculate, flawlessly tailored, the fabric moving with him like it belonged to him. Crisp white shirt, silk tie, everything about him whispered money, precision control. His hair was silver, distinguished, not dull, and perfectly combed. His skin was dark weathered, but well-kept features defined by a strong jaw and high cheekbones. But his eyes held me still, deep brown, intense, filled with something I couldn't name. Not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition, relief, emotion. So raw it made my chest tighten like he was looking at someone he'd lost, and after impossible odds found again. Mr. Miller, he said softly. His voice was deep, steady, touched with the cadence of privilege. I hope I didn't startle you. My throat was still raw. Who are you? He leaned in slightly, hands still folded. My name is Stanley Walker. He paused as though expecting the name to mean something. It didn't. And I've been searching for you for 40 years. 40 years. The words hung between us like something fragile. I think you have the wrong person, I said, my voice. I'm nobody, just Thomas Miller, retired warehouse worker, widower, absent son. Bitterness crept out before I could stop it. There's nothing special about me, nothing worth searching for. Stanley shook his head slowly. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair. No, Mr. Miller, you're wrong about that. I'm not. You're not nobody, he said, gently but firmly. You'll never work. My heartbeat spiked. The monitor beside me beeped faster. I don't understand. I don't know you. I've never seen you before. I know, he said softly. You wouldn't remember me. You wouldn't remember anything from before. He drew a slow breath, bracing himself. But I remember you. I've carried your face in my mind for 4 decades. And I made a promise to someone very important that I would find you, no matter how long it took. A promise to whom my head swam. None of it made sense. What are you talking about? Stanley reached into the leather briefcase beside him. His movements were deliberate, careful, as if he were handling something sacred. When his hand emerged, he held a photograph, old, worn at the edges, yellowed with ojai, clearly looked at many times. Before I explain, Stanley said quietly, "I need you to say something." He held the photo out to me. My hands trembled as I reached for it, just as they had when I'd found David's note. But this trembling felt different, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. I looked down at the photograph, and when I saw the face staring back at me, my breath caught in my throat. The photograph was old. So old the edges had softened, and the colors had faded into warm sepia tones. But the two men in it were sharp, clear. On the left stood a young man, maybe 28, dark suit, strong shoulders, thick hair combed back. His face was confident, alive, and familiar. Too familiar. On the right stood an older man in his 60s, silver hair, broad build, expensive 3-piece suit. Behind them rose a white mansion with tall columns and wide windows that gleamed in the sunlight. I stared at the young man's face, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the angle of the cheekbones. It was like looking into a mirror that had been buried for 40 years. "Who is this?" I whispered. Stanley didn't answer right away. He just watched me with those sad, patient eyes. "Do you recognize him?" he asked quietly. I wanted to say no, but the words stuck in my throat. Because I did recognize him. Not in memory, but in a feeling I couldn't name, like I was looking at someone I used to be. "I don't know," I said harassingly. He looks like you," Stanley finished gently. I shook my head. "That's impossible. I've never. Your name is not Thomas Miller," Stanley said. The world tilted.
"What?"
He pointed to the young man in the photograph. "This is you, 40 years ago." Then he tapped the older man's face. "And this is your father, Charles Brennan." My hands started shaking. No, my name is Thomas Miller. I grew up in St. Augustine's orphanage in Worcester. I would have a father. I never had a father." Stanley's voice stayed calm, steady. "That's what they wanted you to believe." Think my voice cracked. "Who's they?" He didn't answer. He just kept looking at me with that unbearable sadness. "I'm nobody," I said, my throat tight. "I'm just a guy who drove a truck for 30 years. I'm just your not nobody." Stanley's voice sharpened. Not angry, just firm, like he wouldn't let me lie to myself anymore. "You are Alexander Brennan. You are the only son of Charles Brennan, one of the wealthiest men in Boston." I couldn't breathe. "Your real name," Stanley said quietly, "is Alexander Brennan." The name echoed in my head like something I'd heard in a dream I couldn't remember. I don't understand." Stanley leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. 40 years ago," he said slowly, "something terrible happened to you." My heart pounded. What do you mean you disappeared?" Stanley said. "You vanished. And someone made very sure you'd never remember who you were." The photograph trembled in his hands. "Your father," Stanley whispered, "spent the last 15 years of his life searching for you. And when he died 2 years ago, he left everything to you." I stared at him, my vision blurring. "Everything," I echoed. "His company, his fortune, his legacy." Stanley's voice broke just a little. "What $800 million? Alexander, it's yours. It always was." The room spun. I gripped the edge of the bed, my knuckles white. I can't." Stanley stood up slowly. He placed the photograph gently on the table beside me. "I know this is overwhelming," he said softly, "but I need you to understand something." He looked me straight in the eye. 40 years ago, someone stole your life, and they've been living off it ever since." My chest tightened. "Who?" I whispered. "Who did this to me?" Stanley's expression darkened. "That," he said quietly, "is what I'm here to tell you." Hours passed as Stanley told me a story that sounded impossible, but the more he spoke, the more fragments of my broken memory began clicking into place. 40 years ago, Alexander Brennan and I was driving home from a business meeting in New York. It was late. The roads were empty, and then somewhere on a dark stretch of highway outside Boston, my car went off the road. The crash was brutal. Head trauma, broken ribs, internal bleeding. When I woke up in a hospital 3 weeks later, I couldn't remember my name, couldn't remember my family, couldn't remember my life. The doctors called it retrograde amnesia. They said my memory might come back. It never did. And that's when my uncle saw his opportunity. Richard Brennan was my father's younger brother. He'd always lived in Charles' shadow, always resented it. And when I disappeared, injured and lost, Richard didn't bring me home. He hid me. He placed me in St. Augustine's orphanage under a false name, Thomas Miller. He forged documents, altered Wreckers made sure no one would ever connect the broken man in Worcester to the missing heir in Boston. Then he went back to my father and told him I was dead. He held a funeral, buried an empty casket, and took control of Brennan Industries, because with me gone, he was the only Brennan left. Stanley paused, his jaw tight. Richard was arrested 3 months ago, he said quietly. The evidence finally caught up to him. That was it. That was all Stanley said about Richard. Short, cold, factual. Because the real story wasn't about Richard, it was about my father. Charles Brennan never believed I was dead. He couldn't. He refused to accept it. So he spent decades searching for me, hiring investigators, following leads, chasing ghosts. But every trail led nowhere. Because Richard had buried my identity so deep, even the best investigators couldn't find it. Stanley's voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind it. The years of searching, the years of hoping. I sat there in the hospital bed staring at the photograph of the young man I used to be, and I felt like I was falling through the floor. I wasn't Thomas Miller. I'd never been Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller was a lie, a mask, a false life built on top of a stolen one. My real name was Alexander Brennan. I was the son of a man I'd never known, the heir to a fortune I'd never touched, the victim of a betrayal I couldn't even remember. Everything I thought I knew about myself, every memory, every belief, every piece of my identity was based on a foundation that didn't exist. I'd spent 70 years living someone else's life, and the worst part, I'd raised a son in that life. I'd loved him, sacrificed for him, built everything around him, and he'd thrown me away like trash. David didn't even know. He didn't know that the father he abandoned was worth $800 million, that the man he called a burden was the rightful owner of one of the largest companies in New England. He thought I was nobody, and maybe in a way I'd thought so, too. But I wasn't nobody. I was Alexander Brennan, and everything I had lost, my name, my father, my life was about to come back. I looked up at Stanley, my throat tight. There was one question I had to ask, one question I was terrified to hear the answer to. My father, I whispered. Is he still alive? Stanley's face fell, and I knew the answer to my question broke my heart. But what Stanley said next made me realize, even in death, my father was still trying to save me. I'm so sorry, Stanley said softly. He passed away 2 years ago. Heart disease. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. 2 years I'd been alive. I'd been right here, just a few hours away in Worcester. And my father had died without ever knowing I was still out there, without ever seeing me again. I'd finally found him, and I'd lost him in the same breath. I pressed my hands over my face, trying to hold back the tears. But they came anyway, silent, bitter, full of a grief I didn't know how to name. I'd never known Charles Brennan, but somehow I mourned him like I'd lost him twice. Stanley gave me a moment. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax. Your father never stopped looking for you, he said quietly. And before he died, he made sure you'd be taken care of, no matter when. We found you. He handed me the envelope. Inside was a will typed, notarized, dated 18 months ago. I scanned the pages, my hands trembling. Charles Brennan had left me 75% of Brennan Industries, one of the largest privately held companies in New England, plus $800 million in liquid assets. $800 million. I stared at the number until it stopped meaning anything. How? My voice cracked. How did you find me? Stanley's expression solved. When you were admitted to the hospital 2 weeks ago, they ran standard blood work. Your DNA was entered into the system. I've had alerts set up for decades, searching for any genetic match to the Brennan family. He paused. 3 days ago, I got a hit. 3 days. I'd been lying here in a coma, abandoned by my son, and Stanley had been racing to reach me. I came as soon as I could, Stanley said. I needed to be sure it was really you before I said anything. I looked down at the will again, at my father's signature at the bottom, Charles Brennan, a man I'd never met. A man who'd spent 40 years searching for me, a man who died still hoping, and he'd left me everything. But Stanley's face darkened. Mr. Brennan, he said carefully, there's something else, something urgent. I looked up. It's about your son, David. My chest tightened. Stanley leaned forward, his voice low and serious. While you were in the coma, I did some digging. I needed to understand your life, your situation, and what I found. He hesitated. David didn't just abandon you. He stole from you. The heir left. Milan's what? His savings account? Stanley said. The one you'd been building for years? $45,000? David drained it 3 weeks ago. Transferred it all to his personal account. I felt like I'd been slapped. $45,000. Every penny I'd saved, every extra shift I'd worked, every sacrifice I'd made, gone. But that's not the worst part, Stanley said, his jaw tight. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Mr. Brennan, he said quietly, your son works at Brennan Industries. The room tilted. He's been working there for 8 years. He's a vice president in operations. He earns $250,000 a year. I couldn't breathe. David had been working at my father's company, my company this whole time, living off my family's legacy, and he'd never known. And there's more, Stanley said, his voice dropping. I barely managed to whisper more. Stanley's eyes locked on mine. Mr. Brennan, he said slowly, your son didn't just abandon you and steal from you. He pulled out another folder, thicker, heavier. He tried to kill you. I thought my son abandoned me out of selfishness. Stanley showed me the truth was far darker. The next morning, he returned with stacks of files, evidence he'd been gathering. For days, we weren't in my hospital room anymore. He'd rented a private office down the hall, quiet and private, a place where nothing would interrupt what I was about to learn. He spread the files across the table like a prosecutor. Let's start with the money, he said. He opened the first folder, bank statements marked in yellow. Your savings account, $45,000. He spent years building it. I nodded. Every extra shift, every sacrifice, all for David's future. 3 weeks ago, Stanley said, while you were in the coma, David transferred the entire balance into his personal account, small amounts at a time to avoid attention. He slid the printout toward me. Every date, every withdrawal, all taken while I lay unconscious. Stanley opened another folder, photographs. David at a 5-star steakhouse. David shopping at a luxury boutique. David with a blonde woman, Jessica, wearing a sparkling necklace. He burned through the money in 2 weeks, Stanley said. Dinners, clothes, jewelry. He didn't even wait to see if he'd wake. My hands shook. It wasn't about the money. It was the celebration of my absence. Stanley placed a hospital billing statement in front of me. When they asked him to cover your expenses, he said, I can't afford it. He's on his own. The words hit harder than any fall. Then Stanley opened another folder. Now, let's talk about David's job. He slid over an employee profile. David Miller, Vice President, Acquisitions Division, Brennan Industries. My son, smiling in a corporate headshot. He earns $250,000 a year, Stanley said, plus bonuses. I felt my breath catch. The irony, he added, is that he works for the company. Your father built a company that legally belongs to you. He has no idea. I stared at David's photo, his success thriving atop the legacy I'd lost. Then Stanley picked up the thickest folder. Mr. Brennan, there's something worse. I didn't believe worse was possible. 3 months ago, he said you fell down the stairs at your apartment. That fall put you in the coma. I nodded faintly. I remembered the dizziness, the crash. It wasn't an accident. He plugged a USB drive into a laptop. A hallway camera video appeared. David walked up the stairs, looked around, then poured liquid onto the steps. Water, something slippery. Then he tugged the already loose railing, the one I'd asked him to fix, and loosened it more, deliberately. Then he walked away. My chest tightened. Stanley played the next clip. Me moving carefully up the stairs, struggling with balance. My hand reached for the railing. It snapped. I fell. I remembered the crack of my skull, the darkness swallowing me. He knew about your vertigo, Stanley said. He knew you relied on that railing, and he ensured it would fail. I felt sick as he placed printed text messages before me. David, if the old man has an accident, at least I won't have to keep throwing money at him. Jessica, you think he'll fall? David, he's clumsy enough, and that railing's been loosed forever. Finally, Stanley placed a life insurance policy on the table. $500,000. Beneficiary, David Miller. Purchased 2 weeks before your fall. My vision blurred. He planned it, Stanley said quietly. He created the conditions. He waited for you to fall, and he expected you to die. I couldn't speak. My son hadn't just abandoned me. He'd tried to kill me. Stanley lifted his phone. Should I call the police? I sat silently hollow. Then, something inside me shifted. Cold, sharp clarity. "No," I whispered. Stanley blinked. "No, I don't want the police. I want David to see exactly who he abandoned." I met his eyes. "Take me home, Stanley. Take me to the Brennan estate." For 40 years, I'd lived in cramped, narrow spaces. Now Stanley was driving me toward a place he called home, a place I couldn't remember. Yet something in me responded to the word. That afternoon, after my discharge papers were signed, he drove me through Boston. I watched the city blur past, the neighborhoods where I'd worked, struggled, raised my son. Then the scenery began to shift. The buildings grew grander, the streets quieter, the cars more expensive. "We're entering Beacon Hill," Stanley said softly. "Your family has lived here for 3 generations. Beacon Hill, a world I'd never belonged to, as Thomas Miller, but Alexander Brennan did." We turned onto a private avenue and slowed before a massive 12-foot iron gate, intricate scrollwork woven through the metal. At the center, a bronze plaque read Brennan Estate. The gate opened smoothly as we approached, like it recognized me. My breath caught as we drove down a long, oak-lined driveway. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting gold across the pavement. A marble fountain stood at the center of the circular drive, water cascading in soft, rhythmic arcs. As I stared at it, a memory flickered. A little boy running barefoot around the fountain, laughter echoing, a man's warm voice calling out, "Careful, Alex, you'll slip," me spinning with joy. The memory vanished, but the ache it left behind did not. Stanley parked in front of the mansion, 3 stories, white columns, tall black shuttered windows, a wide stone staircase. The front door was dark, polished wood gleaming in the afternoon light. It looked unreal, like something from a history book. I stepped out slowly, legs still weak. The air smelled different here, clean, sweet, like grass and privilege. As I stood staring, the front door opened. A line of staff walked out, housekeepers, groundskeepers, a chef. They arranged themselves neatly, faces warm but formal, and bowed, their heads in unison. "Welcome home, Mr. Brennan." My throat tightened. 2 weeks in a hospital alone, no visitors, no flowers, no one who cared, and now a mansion I didn't remember, filled with people who'd been waiting for me to return for 40 years. I didn't know what to feel. Stanley stood beside me, hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "This is yours, Mr. Brennan. It always has been." I looked around at the fountain, the towering trees, the grand house. My son had been living off my scraped together savings, stealing what little I had. Meanwhile, this had been his true inheritance, and he'd thrown it away because he believed I was nothing. He had no idea what he'd lost. "Shall we?" Stanley asked. I nodded. Together, we climbed the stone steps. As we reached the top, the massive door swung open. The moment I crossed the threshold, a scent hit me. Rich, layered, unmistakable. Polished, wood, old leather, something deeper I couldn't name. It stirred something buried. Then I heard it, a voice, distant, echoing from somewhere deep inside memory. A man's voice, warm, strong, familiar. "Alex, come here, son." I froze, my heart hammered. The voice faded as quickly as it came, but I knew deep in a place, untouched for 40 years, that voice had been my father's. The house was full of memories, but they didn't haunt me. They welcomed me home. I stepped deeper into the entrance hall, warm light spilling through tall windows. And then I saw them. Photographs. Dozens lining the walls in elegant frames. I walked closer, breath-catching on the left. A boy of 8, with dark hair and bright eyes, standing beside a tall man in a tailored suit. Charles Brennan, my father. And the boy was me, Alexander. My fingers trembled as they touched the glass. My father's hand rested on my shoulder in the picture, his expression proud and loving. A tear slid down my cheek. Next was a photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes. Eleanor Brennan, my mother. She had died when I was 10. I stared at her, trying to summon a memory, but all I felt was the hollow ache of loss. Stanley stood beside me, quiet. "Would you like to see more?" I nodded. He led me through the house, room after room, each filled with pieces of a life I no longer remembered. The library, towering shelves, leather chairs, a fireplace, a flicker of memory. Me as a child reading on the floor while my father said, "What book did you pick today, Alex?" The dining room, mahogany table, chandeliers, the faint echo of laughter, the garden roses, stone pathways, a gazebo. Suddenly, I was 7 again, chasing a dog whose name I couldn't yet recall. Every room held fragments of me, fragments someone had stolen. "This was my home," I whispered. "And it can be again," Stanley said. Over the next 2 days, the transformation began. A tailor, a stylist, a barber. They brought me into a massive walk-in closet, rows of tailored suits, Italian shoes, silk ties. I tried on a charcoal suit. It fit perfectly. The stylist trimmed my hair. The barber shaped my beard. The tailor adjusted the jacket. Then Stanley handed me a sleek, expensive watch. I fastened it around my wrist and stood before a mirror. The man looking back wasn't Thomas Miller. He was Alexander Brennan, strong, composed, and controlled. "This is who I am," I murmured. Stanley smiled. "Yes, sir, it is." That evening, we met in the study. Stanley spread documents across the desk. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "David doesn't know you're alive. He thinks you're still in the coma, or that you've died." I nodded. "That means we have the element of surprise." He pulled up a calendar. "I've scheduled an emergency board meeting at Brennan Industries. Friday, 10 a.m. Every executive will be there, including David." My pulse quickened. "You'll walk in," Stanley said unannounced. "Introduce yourself as the rightful owner and take control." I stared at the date. 2 days. "What about the evidence?" I asked. Stanley tapped a thick folder. "Everything is ready. DNA proving your identity, your father's will, ownership documents, and the evidence against David bank transfers, text messages, the security footage of the stairwell, the insurance policy, all verified." He looked me in the eye. "Legally, you are untouchable, and David is finished." I sat back, letting it settle. Part of me wanted the police to drag David away immediately, but another part, older, sharper, forged in betrayal, wanted something else. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to face exactly what he'd thrown away. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I said slowly. "I'm doing this because David needs to understand consequences. He needs to learn that real success is earned, not stolen." Stanley nodded. "Understood." I looked down at David's photographs, the proof of what he'd done. "He thought I was nothing," I said. "A burden he could abandon, but he was wrong." I looked up, my voice steady. "In 2 days, I'm going to walk into Brennan Industries. David will see me, not the man he discarded, but the father who owns everything he's been pretending to inherit." Stanley's expression didn't change, but satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "The board meeting is set," he said. "Everything is in place." I stood adjusting my suit jacket. "Then let's make sure David never forgets this day." While my son was celebrating what he believed was freedom from me, I was preparing to walk into his world and tear it apart. 3 days later, Friday morning, David Miller arrived at his office carrying a bottle of champagne. He was glowing. He dropped the bottle onto his desk with a triumphant thud, leaned back, and kicked his feet up. Mark from accounting stopped at the door. "Champagne at 9 a.m., he laughed. "What's the occasion?" Davy spun his chair grandly. "Gentlemen, drinks on me. I just got placed on the senior VP track." Co-workers appeared, congratulating him. "That's huge," one said. "End of the quarter," David replied, popping the cork and sending it across the room. "But I'm celebrating now. Life is very good." Mark hesitated. "Hey, how's your dad? Heard he was in the hospital." David's smile stayed, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "Don't worry about him. That situation's been handled. He's out of the picture now." Sensing something off, Mark nodded and moved on. David dialed Jessica. "Baby, we're celebrating tonight. Anywhere you want?" "What are we celebrating?" she asked. "The old man is finally out of our lives," David said smoothly. "No more bills, no more guilt trips. We can enjoy the money without complaining." Jessica laughed. "Perfect. Dinner tonight and the penthouse viewing tomorrow." "Exactly. And maybe that Tesla you want." When he hung up, David checked his phone. No hospital calls. Good. No news was good news. He imagined his future senior VP by year's end. Executive VP in 2 years, maybe. See you. The $15 million Madison contract he'd closed would seal it. At 9:30, every screen in the building flickered. A message appeared. Emergent Soul staff meeting. 10s on AM main auditorium mandatory. David frowned. Then another line appeared. The new chairman of the board will address the company. David blinked. New chairman. Mark reappeared. "You see that?" "Yeah," David muttered. "Who the hell's the new chairman?" "No clue." Mark said. HR isn't saying anything. Lisa from operations appeared behind him. Think it's internal or external? External, Divi said dismissively. Some suit from New York. Doesn't matter. I just closed Madison. They won't touch me. He straightened his tie. Let's get this over with. I've got lunch reservations. Meanwhile, across the city, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the Brennan estate. The final suit was laid out, navy blue tailored perfectly, a silk tie, shoes polished to a mirror shine. I adjusted my cufflinks gold engraved with the Brennan crest. Stanley appeared in the doorway. The car is ready, Mr. Brennan. Are you ready? I looked at myself one last time. Not Thomas Miller. Alexander Brennan, the man my son never imagined still existed. I'm ready, I said. Let's go show my son who his father really is. The black sedan pulled up in front of Brennan Industries, a gleaming glass tower in Boston's financial district. Through the tinted windows, I saw hundreds of employees gathering inside, curious and unsettled. None of them knew how drastically the next hour would change everything, and neither did David. Stanley turned in his seat. Mr. Brennan, it's time. I breathed in slowly. Then I opened the door and stepped into the sunlight. I walked into the building my father built. My son sat inside that room, believing he was untouchable. He was wrong. The glass doors of Brennan Industries slid open as I approached. The lobby with vast marble floors, towering ceilings, a chandelier worth more than most homes. Behind the reception desk, two young women looked up, their gazes shifting from me to Stanley. Their posture changed instantly, but they said nothing. Security guards exchanged glances. One murmured into his radio. Employees slowed, whispering, "Who is that? Is that the new chairman?" Stanley swiped his keycard at the executive elevator. The doors opened immediately. As we arose, he asked quietly, "Are you ready, Mr. Brennan?" I adjusted my cufflinks. I've been ready for 40 years. The elevator opened onto the top floor. Stanley led me to a door marked Auditorium Backstage Access. Through the small window, I saw the auditorium, 500 seats, nearly full. Executives in the front rows, managers in the middle, interns in back, and in the third row sat David, relaxed, laughing, one arm around Jessica's chair, completely unaware. The lights dimmed. The stage spotlight activated. The Brennan Industries logo glowed across the massive screen. Conversation ceased. Stanley squeezed my shoulder. It's time. He stepped onto the stage, calm and commanding. "Good morning," he said into the microphone. "My name is Stanley Walker, Chief Financial Officer of Brennan Industries and longtime advisor to the Brennan family." A ripple of interest moved through the room. "For 40 years, this company has operated without its rightful owner," he continued. "When Charles Brennan's son disappeared, the legacy of this company was stolen." Murmurs spread. "But today," Stanley said, "I have the profound honor of introducing the man who will lead us forward." He turned toward me. "Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander Brennan, son of our founder and rightful owner of 75% of Brennan Industries." The auditorium erupted into stunned whispers. I stepped into the spotlight. For a moment, I was blinded. Then, faces sharpened. Hundreds of eyes, confused, shocked, curious. I walked to the podium. Stanley stepped aside. I didn't speak immediately. I scanned the room. Then I saw him, David. He stared at me, frozen, his mouth open. The color drained from his face. I watched the exact, instant recognition crashed into him. He leaned forward, whispering, "No, no, that's..." His champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Heads turned. He didn't notice. He stared as if he'd seen a ghost. To him, I was a ghost. A ghost who'd returned to life and to power. I held his gaze, calm, unmoving, unavoidable. Good, I thought. Now you know what it feels like when your world shatters. At last, I spoke. "Good morning. Some of you know the Brennan legacy. Some of you work in the building my father built. But almost none of you know who I am." Silence. "My name's Alexander Brennan. I disappeared 40 years ago in an accident. I lost my memory, my home, my identity. I lived as Thomas Miller, a man my own son abandoned in a hospital." Shock rippled across the room. Thanks to Mr. Walker, the truth was uncovered. DNA evidence, my father's will, records proving everything stolen from me. I let that settle. Today, I reclaim my name, my legacy, and this company. I look back at David. Jessica clutched his arm. Employees glanced between us, connecting the dots. David swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. His hands trembled. Brennan Industries enters a new era, I continued. One built on integrity, and that begins with accountability. David Flickshift, for those who have served faithfully, you have nothing to fear. For those driven by greed, I paused. Your time is up. Silence suffocated the room. Stanley stepped forward, placing a folder on the podium, the evidence against David. I rested my hand on it. Let's begin. I called my son to the stage. He came thinking he could talk his way out. He couldn't. The silence in the auditorium stretched. I stood at the podium saying nothing, just looking out at the sea of faces. 500 people, all waiting, or watching. I let the tension build. Then I spoke. David Miller, I said, my voice calm and clear. Please come to the stage. David's face went from pale to white. He didn't move. Jessica, sitting beside him, leaned over and whispered urgently. I couldn't hear what she said, but I could guess. Goal. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe you can fix this. David stood slowly. His legs were shaking. I could see it even from the stage. He walked up the aisle. Every step echoed in the silence. 500 pairs of eyes followed him. He climbed the stairs to the stage, and then he was standing in front of me 2 feet away, close enough that I could see the sweat on his forehead, the panic in his eyes. I didn't speak right away. I just looked at him. The son I'd raised, the son I'd sacrificed everything for, the son who'd left me to die. Finally, I spoke. David, I said quietly, do you know who paid for your MBA at Harvard? David's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You did, Dad, he stammered. But sir, I didn't know you were. And where is your father now? David asked. His face turned red. He's in the hospital recovering from Lyre. The word cut through the room like a blade. David flinched. I am standing right here, I said, my voice steady. And he left me to die. A ripple of shock passed through the audience. David shook his head frantically. Dad, I didn't mean I raised a hand. He stopped talking. I turned toward the screen behind us and nodded to Stanley. The Brennan Industries logo disappeared. In its place, a scanned image appeared, handwritten, crumpled, unmistakable. David's letter, the one he'd left on my hospital nightstand. I turned back to the microphone and began to read slowly, clearly, so everyone could hear. Dad, I can't keep paying your bills. You're nothing but a burden. Figure it out yourself. Don't call me. Gas echoed through the room. David's face crumpled. Dad, I didn't mean it like that. I was stressed. It was you meant it. I said, you abandoned me when I was dying. You stole my life savings, $45,000. You spent it on dinners, jewelry, and luxury, while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. The audience was dead silent now, all eyes on David. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. You lived off my sacrifices. I continued while I fought for my life. David's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the edge of the podium for support. I stepped closer. For years, I said, my voice low, but cutting. I worked 2 jobs to give you everything. I sold my house to pay for your education. I trusted you. I paused, and you repaid me by waiting for me to die. David's eyes filled with tears. Dad, please, I'm sorry. I saw it doesn't undo what you did, I said. But today, you're going to learn that actions have consequences. I turned to the audience, effective, immediately. I said David Miller is demoted to entry-level analyst. His salary is reduced to $45,000 per year, the exact amount he stole from me. David's face went white. In addition, I continued, he will repay $100,000 through payroll deductions over the next 5 years. This covers the theft, the hospital bills he refused to pay, and the breach of trust. A murmur spread through the crowd. David dropped to his knees. Please, Dad, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please don't do this. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I looked down at him. For a moment, I felt something. Not pity, not forgiveness, just sadness. Cliff was my son, and I'd lost him long before he ever abandoned me. I don't need your apology, I said quietly. I need you to learn what it means to earn your place. I gestured to the security guard standing at the edge of the stage. Escort Mr. Miller out, I said. As the guards moved toward him, Jessica suddenly stood up in the audience. David, she shouted, let's go. This is insane. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit. David looked back at her, then at me, his face a mixture of shame and desperation, but she didn't wait for him. She was already gone. The guards helped David to his feet and led him off the stage. He didn't resist. He just walked head down, shoulders slumped. The room was silent except for the sound of his footsteps. When he was gone, I turned back to the microphone. "Thank you all for your patience," I said. I started to step away from the podium, but then Stanley appeared from the side of the stage, wheeling in another monitor. I stopped. The room, which had just started to relax, went still again. I wasn't finished. "There's one more truth," I said slowly, "that David and everyone here needs to see. I thought exposing my son's greed would be enough, but the people in this room deserve to know the whole truth. Before David leaves this building," I said, my voice echoing through the silent auditorium, "there's one more thing all of you need to see." The back doors opened. 3 uniformed police officers walked inside. They didn't advance, just stood, guard arms crossed. A low murmur rolled through the audience. Then I saw them 2 journalists in the back row, Boston Globe and the Financial. Tides Stanley had invited them personally. This wasn't private anymore. David already halfway to the exits with security stopped. One guard placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly, "you need to stay." David's face drained of color. He turned toward me, wide-eyed, panicked. Stanley pressed a button. The massive screen behind me flickered on. Security footage appeared grainy but clear. This I said as the hallway outside my apartment 3 days before my accident. On screen, David walked up the stairs with a gym bag. He paused at the puddle on the landing. He looked at it, then stepped over it and kept going. He didn't cling it, didn't warn me, didn't fix the leaking pipe. The audience watched in rigid silence. Next, the footage showed him reach the top, railing loose, unstable. I'd asked him for weeks to help tighten it. He grabbed it, felt it wobble, and walked away. Time stopped 3 days before the fall. "I have balance issues," I said. David knew this. He also knew a wet floor and a broken railing could kill me. A hush fell over the room. Stanley switched to the next clip. My breath caught as the audience watched me slow, unsteady, walking up those same stairs 2 days later. I reached for the railing. It snapped. Gasps filled the auditorium as my body crashed down the concrete steps. The impact echoed through the speakers. On screen, I lay motionless. The footage continued. 10 minutes later, a neighbor found me and called 911. Paramedics arrived, loading me onto a stretcher. Then, David's car appeared. He stepped out, saw the ambulance, stared for a moment, and got back in his car. He didn't follow the ambulance. He drove to a shopping mall. The next clip showed him laughing with Jessica in a department store carrying shopping bags while I was in emergency surgery. The room went utterly still. Stanley displayed the next slide in large text messages. "David, if the old man has an accident, at least I won't have to keep throwing money at him." "Jessica, don't say that. What if someone sees David?" "Relax. I didn't do anything. Just didn't stop things from happening." A wave of disgust moved across the audience. Someone whispered, "My God." More messages appeared after my accident. "Jessica, is he going to make it?" "David, doctors say maybe. Doesn't matter. Either way, I'm done." A woman in the 3rd row wiped tears. A man in front shook his head in disbelief. Suddenly, David shouted, voice cracking, "Those are just words. I didn't actually do anything. I didn't push him." "You didn't have to," I replied coldly. Silence. "You saw the danger," I continued. "You knew I was vulnerable, and you walked away. That is criminal negligence. In moral terms, it is attempted murder." David staggered backward, chest heaving. Stanley placed one final document on the podium, a life insurance policy. I lifted it slightly so the front rows could see. "This policy," I said, "was purchased by my son, $500,000. Beneficiary, David Miller." I let the silence deepen. He bought it 2 weeks before my fall. People in the audience recoiled as if the weight of those words physically struck them. I looked directly at David. "This isn't just abandonment," I said quietly. "This is proof that my son wasn't waiting for me to get better." I paused. He was waiting for me to die. The room erupted, Gath. Whispers outrage while David stood frozen, staring at the truth he could no longer outrun. This was the moment I had been building toward, the moment my son would face the consequences of his choices. Stanley pressed another button. The screen behind me shifted to a blown-up image of a document. Insured, Thomas Miller. Beneficiary, David Miller. Payout $500,000. Purchase date: 3 months before the accident. Gas rippled through the room. I steadied myself against the podium. 3 months before my accident, I said my son purchased a $500,000 life insurance policy on me. I locked eyes with David. He created the conditions for my fall. He waited for me to die. And when I didn't, he abandoned me because his plan failed. David collapsed to his knees and the arms lifted in a frantic plea. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he cried. "It was just insurance, I didn't think." "He didn't think I'd survive," I said. "And he didn't think the truth would ever come out." David shook violently, tears streaming. "No, Dad, please. I didn't want you to die. You just wanted the money," I said. "And you were willing to wait for me to die to get it." A woman in the front row sobbed. A man walked out, unable to watch. Journalists scribbled furiously. Then chaos broke loose. Jessica bolted for the exit heels, clacking. 2 guards blocked her. "Let me go," she screamed. "This has nothing to do with me." One guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, you must stay." Jessica spun around, pointing at David. "It was his idea. He bought the policy. I told him it was crazy." David's head jerked up. "You liar," he roared. "You said it was smart that we'd be set for life." Jessica shrieked back. "You said no one would ever know." The two of them, partners in greed, turned on each other in front of everyone. I raised my hand. Silence fell instantly. I looked at David. "I gave you life," I said quietly. "I gave you everything, and you repaid me by trying to take mine." David crumpled, sobbing. "You're no longer my son." I continued, each word sharp and final. "You are a stranger who carries my name." I turned to the crowd. Effective immediately. David Miller is terminated from Brennan Industries. His sobbing grew harsher. Furthermore, he will be blacklisted from every major company in Boston. Shock moved through the audience, and David Miller is removed from all inheritance rights. He will receive nothing from the Brennan estate. Davy looked up at me devastated, and finally I said, voice like steel, "I am legally severing our father-son relationship. From this day forward, David Miller has no claim to me, my name, or my legacy." I looked toward the officers stationed at the back. "Officers, I am filing charges for insurance fraud and reckless endangerment." They moved at once. David tried to stand, but his legs buckled. An officer lifted him and cuffed him. The click echoed like a final verdict. Jessica screamed as another officer restrained her. "This is insane. I didn't do anything. No one reacted." David looked at me one last time, eyes empty and pleading. "Dad," he whispered. "Please." I didn't respond. I simply watched as they were escorted out. The room remained silent, horrified, saddened, stunned. As the doors closed behind him, I felt no triumph, no justice, only a vast, echoing emptiness. Stanley stepped beside me, his hand steady on my shoulder. "Mr. Brennan," he asked softly, "what now?" The battle was over. I'd won. So why did victory taste so bitter? After the police escorted David and Jessica out, I stood alone on the stage, staring at the stunned faces in the auditorium. Some whispered, some cried, some just sat frozen. Stanley leaned in. "The journalists want a statement." I nodded, straightened my tie, and stepped back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, voice steady, despite the exhaustion settling into my bones. "My name is Alexander Brennan, son of Charles Brennan, founder of Brennan Industries and rightful owner of 75% of this company." Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. "Brennan Industries will continue operating as normal," I continued. "My father built this company on integrity. I intend to honor that legacy." A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Brennan, can you comment on what happened with your son?" I met her eyes. "David Miller is no longer associated with this company, in any capacity. Beyond that, I will not comment on private family matters." Another voice called out, "Will you be pressing charges?" "That question has already been answered," I said. "Thank you." I left the podium before more questions could come. Stanley guided me to a private conference room where the board of directors waited. 12 men and women rising to their feet as I entered. Respect, curiosity, uncertainty. I sat at the head of the table. "I know today was unexpected," I said, "but Brennan Industries will move forward with a renewed commitment to ethical business practices and employee welfare. They nodded. In addition, I said I will establish a charitable foundation in my father's name. Its mission will be to support individuals suffering from memory loss and those abandoned by their families. Market, the VP of Operations, smiled softly. A beautiful tribute, Mr. Brennan. My father spent 40 years searching for me, I said quietly. No one else should suffer that long. The board unanimously approved the initiative. By late afternoon, I finally left the building. Stanley drove me back to the Brennan estate in silence. I stared out the window at the same streets I had walked as Thomas Miller, poor, forgotten, invisible. Now I owned the skyline rising above them. When we arrived at the mansion, I didn't step out immediately. You did the right thing, Sir Stanley said gently. I looked at him. Then why does it feel so hollow? Stanley's voice softened. Because justice doesn't erase pain. It only ensures the pain meant something. Inside the house was quiet, grand, beautiful, empty. I stood in the foyer, surrounded by the legacy my father built, the life I had been stolen from. I had everything now. Wealth, power, the company. But I had lost my son. Stanley appeared beside me. You didn't lose him, he said. He lost himself. I nodded, though the ache stayed. Outside the tall windows, the Boston skyline glowed in the fading light. The battle was over, but life moved on whether I was ready or not, and I had work to do. 6 months ago, I woke up as nobody. Today, I finally knew who I was, and it had nothing to do with money or revenge. Half a year had passed. The media frenzy had faded. Lawsuits were resolved, and for the first time, I had room to breathe. I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Brennan estate, watching the sunrise over Boston. Golden light spilled across the skyline, the city already stirring with early traffic. Peaceful. For the first time in decades, I felt at peace. My mornings had settled into a new rhythm. Coffee on the terrace, the business section of the Globe, a briefing from Stanley. Not because I was anxious, but because I had purpose. Brennan Indices was thriving. We'd rebuilt the executive team, promoting people who had integrity and firing those who had enabled corruption. Revenue had grown 18% in 6 months, and employee satisfaction had doubled. I'd kept my promise. And then there was the foundation, the Second Chance Fund, launched 3 months earlier. It had already changed lives. We provided support for people suffering from memory loss, treatment, housing, reunification services. We helped those abandoned by family, offering training, therapy, and temporary shelter. Every week I met with recipients, their stories, their relief, their hope. They reminded me of my father searching for me for 40 years, of waking up alone as Thomas Miller left for dead. This work filled the hollow space inside me. I wasn't empty anymore. Stanley stepped onto the terrace carrying a folder and a cup of tea. Good morning, Mr. Brennan. Morning, Stanley. He handed me the folder. Q2 foundation numbers. Very strong. I skimmed the pages, then asked quietly, "Any news?" He hesitated. "Yes, sir. David was released 3 months ago. The insurance fraud charge was reduced. He served his time in county jail." I nodded, and afterward Jessica left him, returned to her parents. She wants nothing more to do with him. Not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. David moved to Montana, Stanley continued. He works in a warehouse for $15 an hour. He lives in a small apartment outside Billings. Montana, I murmured, as far from Boston as he could run. How do you know all this? A faint apologetic smile. I kept a private investigator on retainer. I thought you'd want updates. I did and I didn't. Then Stanley reached into his jacket and handed me an envelope. Postmarked Billings, Montana, handwriting unmistakable. David Miller. My chest tightened. You don't have to read it, Stanley said gently. I stared at the letter. My hand hovered, then withdrew. I know. Was it apology? Excuse manipulation? I picked up the envelope. It was light, a page or two. Stanley waited silently. Whatever you decide, he said. You've already done the right thing. I nodded, though uncertainty lingered. I set the envelope on the table. Then I looked back at the rising sun, the city I'd reclaimed, the life I'd rebuilt. 6 months ago, I was Thomas Miller, a forgotten man left to die. Today I was Alexander Brennan, father, leader, survivor. One letter remained between my past and my future. But for now, I let it sit unopened, and I watched the sunrise. Later that afternoon, as the sun sank toward the horizon, I picked up the letter again. This time, I opened it. The paper was thin and cheap. The handwriting was David's, messier, shakier than I remembered. I unfolded it and read, "Dad, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm working in a warehouse now. $15 an hour. My back hurts, my hands are blistered. For the first time, I understand what you went through for me. I was greedy, selfish, cruel. I don't know if I can ever become better, but I'm trying. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking to come back. I just want you to know I finally understand what I lost. Not the inheritance, not the company. You. I lost you. And that hurts more than anything the courts did to me. I'm sorry, Dad. Even if you never forgive me, I'm still sorry. David." I finished reading and unexpectedly I cried. Not from forgiveness, not from longing, but because for the first time I believed he understood. I folded the letter gently and walked inside. Stanley was in the study reviewing files. I placed the letter in the top drawer of my desk. "Will you respond, sir?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "Not now. Maybe in a few years. Maybe if he truly changes. Maybe we'll talk then." A pause. "Or maybe we won't." Stanley nodded, understanding. "I'm not bound by blood anymore," I said. "I'm free to choose." And that was true. For years, I had lived under obligation to a son who saw me as a burden, to a name I didn't remember, to a life not fully mine. Now I was free. I stepped onto the terrace. The sun was setting over Boston. His sky painted gold and amber. His city glowed beneath it. Stanley joined me. "Mr. Brennan," he asked softly, "are you happy?" I breathed in the warm evening air. "I am Stanley. For the first time in 40 years, maybe for the first time ever, I'm truly happy." He smiled gently. "I finally learned something important," I said. "What's that?" he asked. I turned to him, the man who had searched for me for 4 decades, who stood by me through every painful revelation. "Family isn't blood," I said. "Family is who stays, who chooses you every day." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "You stayed. You never stopped searching. You never gave up. You're more family to me than David ever was." Stanley's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "It was an honor, sir," he said. We stood in silence, watching the last light of day fade behind the skyline. The terrace felt peaceful, complete. For the first time in years, I felt whole. I wasn't Thomas Millen, the forgotten man, the abandoned father, and I wasn't only Alexander Brennan, the heir with wealth and power. I was simply myself, a man who had been lost and found his way home, not to a mansion or a fortune, but to his own identity. As the stars began to appear, I smiled. I was home because I finally knew who I was, and I was surrounded by those who chose to stay. That was enough. That was everything. If you've made it this far in my true story, thank you for staying with me through every painful moment, every twist, and every hard-won lesson. Looking back now, I see the mistakes I made. Clearly, I gave everything to someone who saw it as weakness, not love. I ignored the warning signs because I wanted to believe blood was thicker than betrayal. Don't be like me. Don't sacrifice yourself for people who wouldn't do the same for you. Don't mistake loyalty for obligation. Here's what I learned. Family isn't about who shares your DNA. It's about who stays when your world falls apart. It's about who chooses you every single day. And sometimes God puts strangers in your path who become the family you were always meant to have. Stanley wasn't my blood, but he was my family in every way that mattered. If there's one thing I want you to take from these grandpa stories, it's this. You deserve people who see your worth. Don't let anyone's son, daughter, husband, wife make you feel like a burden for simply existing. And if you've been betrayed, like I was, no, this justice won't erase the pain, but it will remind you that you'll still matter. This is my true story. A real-life experience shared through Grandpa's stories to remind you that even in our darkest moments, we can find our way back to peace. These are the true stories that need to be told. If this story touched you, please leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from. Hit that like button and subscribe so this channel can keep bringing you powerful grandpa stories like mine. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here. You're not alone.